morning, everyone. My name is Tristan, and I'm absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to present to you this morning. What I would like to talk to you about is how to grow in complexity, but not necessarily in complication. And don't worry, I will define those terms shortly. And I'm looking specifically from a front-end perspective, so native and web. The back-end guys have already got this covered. It's fine. We just need to focus on the front end now. So who am I to talk about this? Well, I've had the privilege to both design and implement code modularization strategies in two organizations. Two very, very different organizations, in fact. Navarre MDX is a small company based in Edinburgh that makes apps that use computer vision techniques to read lateral flow tests, normally for medical diagnostic purposes. FanDuel, on the other hand, is a sports betting company operating primarily in the US. But what both these companies have in common is that they make and support multiple applications with common shared functionality between them. As with ever, we give our projects ethereal names. So in Navarre MDX, we called the modularization strategy the Sweetie Factory. If you want to know why, see me afterwards. And in FanDuel, we've called it Unified Modules. Okay, so I promised you a definition of terms. I particularly enjoyed yesterday, by the way, Joel Chippendale's made-up graphs, as he put it, where he was giving a very similar concept. I've gone for that other staple of management textbooks, the 2x2 matrix, to also show a made-up concept. So I've got complexity represented horizontally on my matrix, and complicatedness or complication represented vertically. You can think of complexity as perhaps the number of things your app does. So maybe it's the number of use cases it solves for a user, or maybe it's the number of screens that are displayed. Maybe it's the number of API endpoints it interacts with in order to get its data. So actually, complexity is a good thing. Implicitly, product folk want us to increase the complexity of applications, starting from an MVP all the way through its life cycle to disposal. Complicatedness, or complication, on the other hand, is the, I guess, negative big brother of complexity, and represents how difficult it is to understand a system or a code base. You could measure this perhaps in how long it takes you to understand which bits of a code base you need to make a change, or indeed how long it takes you to make that change in the first place. And again, this was excellently represented in one of Joel's made-up graphs yesterday. So typically, I think we all believe we start here. I think we probably all do start here, actually. I think as good engineers, we can implement a simple application, and it can be relatively straightforward as well. Sometimes maybe we start in the top left, but I think probably we all start here. Ideally, as we increase the level of complexity in our application, we would like to keep the level of complication roughly static. So it's as easy to maintain the application 2 years after we launched the first version as it is the day we launched it. So just out of curiosity, and by way of a show of hands, how many of you guys work on a project at the moment where you think that sort of direction of innovation represents your sort of work at the moment? A non-zero amount of people whose company I either want to go and work for or are fooling themselves. Okay, I reckon the usual sort of direction of travel is probably something like this. Either because of genuine technical debt, or because of other reasons, perhaps teams have restructured, leading to a Conway's law misalignment. For whatever reason, we end up in a situation where, as we add desirable complexity to our applications, we increase the level of complication. So again, highly scientific poll. How many of you guys reckon that the projects that you guys work on at the moment follow this sort of trajectory. Awesome. If it was the other way around, I was going to stop speaking right now because you didn't need me to say any more. Okay. At some point, we get to a point where we need to do this. The level of complication in our application is so high that the time required, the turnaround time required for us to increment and add new features becomes unwieldy. And therefore, we have to bite the bullet and do something about it and get to a point where we don't necessarily reduce complication to the levels it was back when we were at MVP, but at least to a manageable level. So what I want to talk to you today about is how we've done that within FanDuel specifically. And that's not necessarily how you would do it in your organization, but I'll take you through the process of the problems that we identified that were giving us complication and how we've striven to resolve those. So part one, how we made our complexity complicated. It all started so well. You'll note, by the way, let me just orientate you to these slides. We've got a graph on the left of complexity and complication, and then the right is a bit of a system diagram. Obviously, this doesn't represent everything the app does. That would be a pretty dull app if all it did was session management. But I'm just going to focus on the bits that I'm going to focus on in later slides. So we had a single application. It was great. It did lots of things. One of the things it did was session management. And it interacted with a backend. And the backend did a large number of things. And then two things that the backend does is it provides account services, so the ability for users to sign up or to log in. And also it provides digital wallet services, so the ability for people to add funds to the digital wallet or draw down from it. Complexity is low, complication is low, everyone's happy. Then we made some more apps. We have more than 3 apps, by the way, but again, visual simplicity. I've just represented 3 on here. And one of the things we do is we give the teams freedom to choose a tech stack that they wanted. So that means that we have a variety of different tech stacks. We've got an app which has a fully native approach. So Swift and iOS, Kotlin and Android, React for web. We have another app which has a combined code base, which uses React and React Native in a single code base. We have another app, strangely enough, that uses Unity 3Ds, that's C#. And we have other apps as well. Now, you will note that I have chosen different shades of purple for session management. That wasn't a stylistic choice to make the slide more appealing. Rather, it reflects the fact that each one of these apps implements session management slightly differently. And that will become important in a future slide. Now, we did recognize that there were some user journeys we didn't particularly want to repeat. So we implemented a web interface for some common user journeys. So things like logging in, signing up, those digital wallet user journeys that I referred to before, we implemented as web user journeys. So in native, we would display a web view to present those journeys. And on web, we would have a redirect, or rather a navigation to that page with a redirect back again on completion. So then came the native integrations. At this point, by the way, I've moved the web and the backend off, just so that we can see what's going on. It was at this point really that we sort of realized that we needed to sort of break stuff off into client libraries. Mostly around the account side, we needed to do things around ID verification, anti-fraud detection, and other things. And so we needed to make sure we needed to leverage some SDKs on the native side. Well, the apps are already using web views, so the simple thing to do here was to make a WebView SDK, which bundled these native integrations together. And so all the apps had to do was swap out their existing WebView implementation and swap it for the one that we provided. And that was fine. Already, however, you can see that we're getting a bit of a spider's web of complexity here. One of the other things we made, by the way, was a geolocation library. So we operate in a regulated space where we have to know which state in the US a user is located because different rules apply to different states. So that was a requirement as well. But the geolocation library requires information about the account session, which means that the app's responsibility is not only to use the libraries it wants to use, but also to broker the relationships between the libraries it depends on. Okay, so, and finally, complication has reached critical levels as we now cross-sell experiences between the apps. What I mean by that is we have lots of apps, and in some cases, we want to be able to provide users with experiences from one app within a different host app. And so we effectively, well, there are different approaches to this. In some cases, a team will make code changes directly into the host app. In other cases, we will provide an application experience as a library using some of the code from the cross-sold app. So now we've got a complete spider's web of dependency management. Clearly, all the apps as a library that we're providing for cross-sell have exactly the same dependencies as the host app. And it's now the responsibility of the host app to provide the glue logic between them. So what are we going to do about the situation? Well, I think first things first, we need to kind of understand exactly what our problems are. And we can think about this in two respects. I've come back, by the way, to the full system diagram. The back end is back. It didn't disappear completely. What happens when we try and make a change? So I want to think about what happens when we make a change to account services. Well, the first thing is, it's going to take us longer to think about whether we can make the change at all. Remember I talked about those different shades of purple in the session management and the apps? Well, one of the consequences of session management being done quite differently across the apps is that we don't necessarily know whether or not we can make a change in the back end without affecting apps differently. And therefore, that slows us down for a start. But let's assume we can make a change. We now have quite a large blast radius. Probably we're going to have to make a change to the core web user journeys. That's fair enough. We're definitely going to have to make a change to the library that integrates those changes. But we're also going to have to make changes in every single one of the apps. Now, we have more than 3 apps. We have about 6 across different platforms. So that's a large number of dependencies and coordination required that makes making changes that should be quite simple actually quite complicated. Okay, so let's now look at adding some new functionality within the apps. In this case, we're going to add a new library. So this could be something as straightforward as a customer support library, perhaps, that integrates Salesforce functionality. Well, the app requires that as a dependency, and that's great. But probably the apps that we have cross-sold into host apps also require that functionality. And so, again, we have this requirement whereby we need the host app to make changes to the glue logic to provide these dependencies to the app. And this makes life really, really complicated for the consuming applications who just want to focus on the user experiences they're providing and are instead having to service all the other teams in the organization that want to make a change to something that they are consuming as a library. So what do we do about it? So I want to zoom in now just on a single app, because otherwise this is going to be really difficult to visualize. So let's imagine we've got one app, and that one app is, as you've seen, doing its session management, and it's got its glue logic that's managing its dependencies. And it's depending on its WebView library to present its user journeys for session management and digital wallet. It's also got another app as a library for cross-selling, and it's got its geolocation library. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to standardize the integrations. Remember, we had those different shades of purple. So what we're going to do is we're going to move that session management box into a different library. And the reason we want to do this is a couple of reasons. First of all, it means we get the same implementation of session management across all applications. But also it just gives a better separation of concerns. Why did the consuming app ever need to be bothered about the implementation details of how it gets a session? In this sort of situation, the application can ask the account library for a session. It can return an asynchronous promise of a session, and then that library can do whatever it needs to do to get a session. Maybe it's got a session that's still valid already, in which case it can resolve it straight away. Or maybe it needs to present some UI, which may be a web view, might be some native view. It doesn't really matter from the consuming apps point of view, in order to get the user to log in. So we get better separation concerns anyway, and it means that there's only one way of doing session management to worry about when we want to make future changes. So now let's sort out these dependencies. So we've still got this really complicated dependency graph here. We've got the dependencies of the app itself onto the libraries, which is probably something we want to keep, but we've also got this glue logic between all these dependencies, and it's quite a complicated dependency graph to manage, coupled to the fact that with everything depending solidly on each other, we can quite easily end up in dependency hell, where mismatches in versions between dependencies cause us problems. Okay, that's better. So, to solve this, we used a pattern which is, I think, quite commonly used in .NET circles, less commonly in native, I think. And that's called the IOC pattern, or the inversion of control. So in this pattern, what we do is we make all our libraries that we make depend on the same service locator or inversion of control container. So the consuming app depends on the libraries, and the only thing it is required to do is call initialize on those libraries. And when you call initialize on those libraries, that registers that library as an implementation of a particular interface against the IOC container. Then when anything wants the services of that particular library, they just resolve the implementation of that interface from the IOC container. So if we take, for example, the geolocation library in this case, it definitely needs to know about the user session, but it doesn't need the consuming app to provide that user session. It just asks for the thing that provides the account contract from the service locator, and then that is provided because previously the account library has been initialized and therefore registered on the IOC. So this is probably the single most simplifying aspect of the modularization strategy that we've done. We also made some tools for teams. One of the things that we need to cater for is the fact that we have lots of teams in an organization, all of whom are going to be making libraries, and we want them to make libraries in broadly the same way so that they can all take part in the ecosystem that I've just described. So if anyone here has contributed to Homebrew, I do apologize for the fact that we've clearly ripped off the name. Please don't sue us. Our tool is called FanBrew. It operates a little bit like Homebrew. And it allows, it gives a CLI, a command line interface for teams to create their own projects. And what it will give you is a folder structure with ready-to-go code templates for iOS, Android, and React. And it also gives you all the scripting you need for CI and making releases. So literally what would otherwise be probably a day of effort to set up a project and your scripting and your CI targets, and I'm probably being generous, it's probably more like 2 days worth of effort, is taken care of in 5 minutes. And it's done in a way that means that everyone is getting the same approach, which means that you could theoretically move people between teams and they would understand what they're working on. Okay, so the benefits. We're still working on this, by the way, so I don't have any sort of nice figures to show you of time saved because we're still sort of measuring that sort of thing. Remember I told you about the blast radius, the changing something in the account backend? Well, now the blast radius is just the account library. The app is only interested in a method that returns an authentication token. So as long as the changes that we're making don't change the fact that all an app needs is an authentication token, then nothing needs to change in the app. We just need to change the account library to account for a possibly breaking change in the back end. When we add some new library, the only thing that needs to change is something else that wants to use that new library. So I used the example of a customer support library before. Well, probably the consuming app wants to use it, so it will make a change, but that's fine because that's a change that the consuming app wants to make. Similarly, another app that's doing cross-selling into that application will also probably want to make a change as well. But nothing else needs to make a change that isn't actually involved in directly using the capabilities of that library. Okay, so you've seen this slide before, obviously. So this is where I'd like to sort of challenge you in a way. If I could ask you to take one thing away from my presentation, it would be this. Think about what makes your life complicated in your code base and solve it. And it could be anything from identifying and tackling small to medium-sized tech debt items. So Sahara spoke about this yesterday. Or it could be something as massive as a big tech stack pivot that Anna and Yorgos showed us how to do yesterday when they were moving from native to Flutter. Or it might be something like we've done, where we've modularized our code so that it is simpler for teams to make changes. The bigger point that I haven't had a chance to talk about today, and which I'll be happy to talk about in the, I forgot what it's called, the Q&A session afterwards, is, and probably equally as important, is the stakeholder management. I've purely spoken about the tech, but definitely in a company, in a large company, getting people on board, evangelizing change, as Anna and Yorgos put it, is a massively important part of this process and has to be done in parallel with any of the tech stack. Thank you very much for listening. If you want to contact me, I will be in the office hours afterwards. Alternatively, I am on LinkedIn at that address. Thank you very much.